Hello and welcome to AtlanTec Festival 2022. So we are back for our 8th year and running a packed event again this year. So AtlanTec began on Monday this week and it runs across 5 days where we've been discussing a wide range of topics from autonomous systems to the carbon impact of the online world. We have been demystifying 5G and we've even heard about transforming your life and sleep. That was a very interesting one. So the full festival contains 35 events and over 40 speakers. So if you're interested in attending more sessions tomorrow, I will share the link in the chat and you can sign up there. So on to today's session. So my name is Rachel O'Donnell and I lead the product design org, working on our digital AI solutions at Genesis. So I'm delighted to be here as an event moderator today. We would love for you to get involved in today's discussion, be it comments or questions, and you can use the Q&A function in order to do so. You can also get involved and follow us on Twitter at AtlanTec Festival. I will also share that in the chat and share any thoughts you have using the hashtag AtlanTec. So we are all about what's of interest to our tech community and innovators across the west of Ireland. We want to say a big thank you to our sponsors. These events are supported by the tech community on what we refer to as along Ireland's western seaboard, and we call it the Atlantic Gateway. So thank you again to our sponsors. Now, in a moment, we will hear from Jon'a Joyner. She's Head of Global Inclusion and Belonging at Genesis, and she's going to talk to us about inclusion's role in burnout. So prior to joining Genesis, Jon'a led her own consultancy firm, where she helped organizations such as Amazon, Louis Vuitton, Humana, and lots of others develop tailor-made solutions to develop and engage and retain women and people of color. Now, I personally have had the pleasure of seeing Jon'a's work firsthand at Genesis, where I can tell you that her passion and dedication to create equitable pathways to success just shines through. One aspect of Jon'a's work that has really stood out to me has when she talks about like the need for a resiliency mindset and the importance of a sense of belonging. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what she's going to share today. So please do keep questions coming in and any comments in the Q&A function. And with that, I will pass over to Jon'a.
Thank you, Rachel. I really appreciate that. When I was initially contacted to speak at this event, I had a much different talk prepared. My usual buttoned up keynote, but something about the moment we are in today, collectively as a society, right? Something about the way this year has evolved, the heaviness that has been happening around the world the past few weeks in particular, something about the way that life is happening to us all, it led me to slightly change course for today. And ironically, here in the US, where I'm based, May is Mental Health Awareness Month. So bear with me today as I guide this conversation around inclusion and burnout and the impact that one has on the other. So as far as our agreements, what I am asking of you today is to be present. I hope that we're all comfortable with being uncomfortable at this point, and to always assume positive intent. Listen for understanding, and this goes beyond just our session today, but even as you go throughout your week, as you go throughout your workday as well. And then finally, I'd love to see you engage in the chat as well. So a little bit about our roadmap for today. We're going to define burnout. We're going to talk a little bit about the burnout and the mental health across different demographic sectors. We'll address mental health as a diversity and inclusion issue. And then finally, we'll get into some burnout prevention techniques as well. But right now, I want to engage you a bit. Raise your hand or comment in the chat. Yes, if you have ever felt like you've given so much of yourself to others, to other things, that there was actually nothing left for you. Just take a moment, comment in the chat. Have you ever felt like you've given so much of yourself away to other things, other people, etc., that you didn't have anything left for yourself? Yes, yes, right? I'm seeing it pop up in the chat. And the point of that is to, one, recognize that you're not alone. And if this feeling is chronic, then my friend, you perhaps are speeding down the burnout highway. Imagine, if you will, it's a Sunday morning, per usual routine. I am getting my daughter ready for church. She was about a year and a half old at the time. And after I got her ready, I went to go check in on my husband. Lately, my husband had been moving around slower than normal. He was a bit less talkative, less vibrant. Every move he made really seemed to cause him a great deal of pain. The whites of his eyes had started to yellow. He was sick. He had been sick for a long time. And despite what the doctors had said, the number of surgeries, chemo, radiation treatments that he undergone, he and I always kept going. We stayed active and busy. Basically, we pushed through. But on this day, it finally hit me that perhaps his final days may have been near. And unfortunately, I was right. A few days later, he passed away due to complications of cancer. After I laid my husband to rest, I returned to work. I took on new projects. I kept raising my hand for different things. I even asked for travel opportunities, and I would bring my infant daughter along with me. Honestly, I was crushing it at work. I kept a smile on my face, but internally, I was a hot mess. I was barely holding on, crying myself to sleep each night. I was beyond exhausted. I was overwhelmed. I was grieving. I was traumatized. And I knew that the way that I was living life wasn't sustainable. But I also didn't know how to not operate in the grind, push through, don't feel, hustle, get it done, be strong, make it work. Give everything that you have. And if you have more, well, give that too, right? Wear the cape. That was what I knew. In a society where over hustling and being a superhero can be considered a badge of honor, the result is high achieving, high producing, overly stimulated, chronically tired, and chronically stressed out people. So where does this I can do it all by myself mentality come from? Is it nurture or is it nature? And it's funny how we don't always equate burnout to a mental health crisis or being close to a mental health crisis. So the Irish Times reports that more than 11,000 children and teenagers have accessed mental health services within the past year. And that's 20% above the demand that the health service executive was expecting for the year. The Global Burden of Disease has reported that the first year of the pandemic triggered a 25% increase in reported anxiety and depression worldwide. And the most impacted is generally our youth and women. This directly relates to the fact that in society, we're overwhelmed by the pandemic, stressors and pressures from work, family, etc. And if you couple that with this feeling of I have to do it all, I have to be all for everyone, the effect is devastating. So as I began to dig deeper into my own wellness journey and trying to understand this concept of burnout, two things kept coming up for me. One is this idea of counter dependency, or considered the reverse of codependency. So counter dependency is the state of refusal of attachment, the denial of personal need and dependency. It's driven by an avoidance mindset, usually the avoidance of relying on others because of some sort of mistrust or the consequence of doing so. Counter dependence is being the strong one. And that often comes from learning that people cannot or will not be there for you, right? Leading to not being comfortable being vulnerable with people and not being able to accept help. Now, the other part of understanding burnout, I discovered a term called Superwoman Syndrome. The Superwoman Syndrome has been embedded and ingrained for generations and typically includes 5 elements, and that is an obligation to present an image of strength, an obligation to suppress emotion, resistance to being vulnerable, a drive to succeed despite limited resources, and finally, a feeling of obligation to help others. Unfortunately, the Superwoman Syndrome and this idea of counter dependency were two things that were at play with me in my own situation as I worked to navigate being a new mom, working in corporate, now being a widow and solo parenting, and trying to navigate it all, in addition to just the trauma and the PTSD, if you will, of what I had experienced. But I imagine that though your situation may not have been the same as mine, or may not be the same as mine, many of us are dealing with mounting pressures, things happening within our personal life, within our families, things that are happening at work that are building and building and building and building. And what we often tend to do is just dig ourselves out just a little bit at a time, just enough we can somewhat breathe, right? Just enough so that we're not completely buried, but we're often not motivated, perhaps, to do the hard work to really surface and rise out of what's trying to bury us. So that's a little bit about what I want to talk about today. If we skip forward to the diversity of mental health, recent acts of racism and violence, as well as the health disparities of COVID-19, have taken a toll on our collective mental health. One study finds that anxiety and depression symptoms have more than tripled since 2020, spiking, of course, after incidents such as the murder of George Floyd, the violence in Ukraine, acts of Asian hate, etc. And even beyond the United States, protests for racial justice have reached around the world and have prompted calls for action on a global scale. So to embrace diversity is to offer support to communities facing unfair stigmas. And one of the largest and least discussed stigmas in the workplace are the millions struggling with mental health. So talent development and HR leaders are beginning to understand that mental health and diversity and inclusion are intricately connected. Employees from diverse backgrounds can face lack of representation, microaggressions, unconscious bias, and other stressors that impact their mental health and psychological safety at work. Quite frankly, mental health affects everyone. Individuals, caregivers, even organizations that want to ensure that their employees are healthy, safe, and productive. However, mental health is not as visible as other diversity dimensions. And because mental health illnesses often give way to invisible or non-apparent disabilities, mental health is often misunderstood and stigmatized, and quite frankly overlooked. So the first step in breaking the stigma The stigma seems simple. Talk about it. But it can be hard to talk about something that you can't see. Mental health can be particularly difficult to discuss in communities of color, with the LGBTQIA plus community, and among women who face additional cultural stigmas, biases, and in many cases, lack of access to important mental health resources and care. Underrepresented groups are less likely to receive the mental health services that they need as well. So oppression, discrimination, bias, racism, none of those things should be ignored when we're discussing mental health, especially now that mental health related issues have skyrocketed. And the burnout experience and mental health symptoms across racial and ethnic groups, gender, age, sexual orientation, and parents compared to non-parents is significant. Just think for a moment about the intersectionality of that. If someone identifies in more than one of those areas that I just mentioned, the compounding stress response or burnout experience that they may be susceptible to is overwhelming. So how does this show up at work? Workplace trauma. Well, studies show that 62% of missed work days can be attributed to mental health conditions, including burnout. And missed work days obviously leads to loss of productivity and can impact a company's bottom line. There is more that's driving burnout, though, today than just pandemic-related factors. The truth is, much of it comes from organizational factors that many companies were getting wrong well before March 2020. So when it comes to workplace trauma, I'll give you an example. How many of you have ever taken some time off just for you? A mental health day, for example, only to return to the office and find yourself back in that same space that feels hostile and triggering. You find yourself spending emotional and mental energy stressors versus being able to simply operate in your genius of whatever your role is. More plainly put, you may spend most of your time trying to figure out how to deal with microaggressions from your boss or your colleagues and working to cover your A, right? Cover your you know what, versus being able to just focus on your job and doing that well. Or perhaps you've stopped contributing in meetings because you don't feel like your voice is valued or even appreciated. Maybe you're the only one in your team who looks like you or has your background, so you don't think you have anything in common with your teammates. This is also an example of a lack of psychological safety. So let's break down microaggressions a little bit more. Psychologists often characterize microaggressions as a death by 1,000 cuts. Think about that, right? A paper cut in and of itself is annoying. May not be deadly, but it is annoying. But if day in and day out, you continuously get these paper cuts, right? These continuous annoyances, that builds up over time. And eventually, with enough paper cuts, you can bleed out. So microaggressions are the everyday slights, the put downs, the insults that members of generally marginalized and minoritized groups experience in their day-to-day interactions with individuals who are often unaware that they have engaged in an offensive or demeaning way. Microaggressions can be as overt as watching someone who potentially doesn't look like you in a store for possible theft. Or it could be disguised as a compliment. Like, you're so articulate. You're so beautiful for a woman who looks like you. Fill in the blank. Those are all examples of microaggressions. So over time, the impact of microaggressions and micro insults lead to chronic stress. Often the terms stress and burnout are sometimes used interchangeably. They do exist on the same spectrum, but there are some key differences. For one, stress is normal. Burnout is not. Burnout is a response to extended excessive stress that just leaves you mentally and physically drained. You may even feel detached and less effective as a result. And left unresolved, someone could feel just simply empty, lacking motive, pessimistic, and generally careless about life. This is burnout and is the generally one of the earlier rungs of other mental health conditions like depression. Typically, women in the workplace are burning out faster than men, but burnout is primarily considered a workplace issue, affecting people who are overworked, but also under-challenged or treated unfairly in the workplace. So whether you feel like you're running on fumes and unable to perform basic responsibilities and no longer enjoy the things you once did, that is a really good sign that you are in burnout. I love this quote that says, doing your best does not mean working yourself to the point of a mental breakdown. It's also important to consider that sometimes there are internal behaviors that lead to chronic stress, not just external. So I want to talk through the 7 types of rest. As working professionals, care providers, parents, etc., on the front lines of constantly advocating for others, we must also do the work to be well ourselves. And a ways to do that is rest. So often when we think of rest, we mainly think of sleep. While it is true that your body and brain do need sleep on some level just to function, there are other types of rest that often go unnoticed that are just as important. So let's start with the most obvious, which is physical. Physical is actually broken into categories, passive and active. So passive physical rest is sleep. Active physical rest allows the body an opportunity to restore and recover, like yoga, massage therapy, or stretching. Mental rest is important for mental clarity. Our brains need time to rest as well. If you've ever found yourself in a brain fog, well, mental rest is where you stop forcing your brain to work so hard and give it some time to process information. Mental rest is essential to learning and processing. If we are constantly producing, constantly thinking, always in this sort of fight or flight mode, we never give our brains an opportunity to rest. Sensory. Just take a look around you for a second. How many different screens or tabs do you have open right now? How many different things are you doing right now while you're listening to me? What about the noise from your street, your dog, your kid? I don't know about you, but yesterday, my daughter's school was out, so she was home working with me. And the number of times that she said, "Mommy," it felt like it was like 675 times. "Mommy, mommy, mommy, mommy," right? Like that is part of the sensory experience that we have. So whether we realize it or not, our senses are being overwhelmed with tons of stimuli all day long. And when we live in a busy world with everything that's happening, our conscious mind often tunes out some of that so that we can focus on what needs to be done. But our brains are still trying to process it. That's why the mental rest and that sensory rest is so important. Because eventually we can become overloaded with all of the sensory input that we're receiving. Next, you have creative. Creative rest is similar to mental rest, but not exactly the same. So creative rest thrives on being able to see things differently, which It's hard to do when you're so focused on creating that you don't really have time to, again, internalize and process. This is especially important for those who need to problem solve, brainstorm, or create as part of your job or career. So think about functions like marketing or advertising, even in tech. Giving yourself a period of creative rest means taking some time to stop doing and instead to observe, to think. Emotional. When you're going through emotional exhaustion, you might find that your tolerance for strong feelings is a lot lower than it normally is. You may lose your temper more easily, or perhaps you're on the verge of tears faster than usual. Emotional exhaustion might also manifest as physical tiredness or distraction or even lack of motivation. So if you need emotional rest, it's a great chance that you have a social rest deficit as well. Social, even the most outgoing of extroverts may sometimes find that they need a break from being around other people. Social rest is important because it gives us a time to connect with ourselves and experience our own company without the distraction of others. Me personally, I'm an introvert, so I need social rest all the time. Working in a remote environment works for me because it allows me to sort of withdraw as I need to. But on the flip side of that, sometimes I crave social interaction because I don't get it normally, right? So that's an opportunity of listening to our bodies, listening to the things that we need, and then going out and manifesting that. So lastly, we have spiritual, which more broadly refers to how people draw meaning from their lives and how we connect to one another and the world around us. When we don't give ourselves time to experience meaningfulness and connection, kind of what I was just talking about, connection with other people, you may start to feel spiritual exhaustion. So at one point or another, we're all going to need every type of rest on this list. You may even need more than one type of rest right now. Much like life, it's a flow. 17 tabs open now. Yes. Some of us get it, right? So how do we break the stigma at work, right? Coming back to the workplace. Break the stigma of identifying and recognizing that focusing on mental health is incredibly important, and that it is important to be inclusive when we consider what that means as well, right? Because offering support and resources and help from a mental health perspective is not going to look the same for everyone. So it is important to put on that inclusion hat and that inclusion lens. So here are a couple of ways to reduce the stigma and create a workplace that is more inclusive to those dealing with mental health challenges, which would include burnout. One is we really have to work on increasing our awareness. So this could be as simple as giving employees access to educational resources. But what this also means as leaders, as folks within the HR teams as well, building inclusive leadership, building cultural awareness, building cultural fluency, those are all things that are very, very important as well, because it all works together. Also, include mental wellness in wellness benefits. More and more companies are starting to do this and starting to realize the importance of mental wellness and offering solutions. But we're not there yet. Also, encourage a healthy work-life blend. This is really critical, right? Again, in the tech space, that is often very challenging, right? This work-life, I didn't say balance, I said blend. I don't really believe in balance. I don't really think it's a thing, right? Because sometimes in life, there are certain areas and aspects of our lives that require more of us than other times. So we have to work to figure out what is the healthy blend. I like to think about it as juggling balls, right? Some balls are glass, some are rubber. You don't want to drop the glass balls. If you drop the rubber ones, guess what? They'll bounce back. You'll bounce back, right? But we want to avoid dropping those glass balls. So for me, my daughter, right? I don't want to drop the ball when it comes to her and giving her what it is that she needs in the moment, right? So for me, that's a glass ball. So it's important for us all to recognize, what does that blend look like for you? What is your glass ball and what is your rubber ball? Also, it's important to vocalize leadership's support in behavior changes. Again, within your organizations, it's usually about the shadow of a leader, right? So when it comes to behavior changes, leadership has to be engaged, leadership has to be on board, and also has to be part of the voice as well when it comes to behavior changes and breaking the stigma at work. And then finally, continuously track engagement to keep the pulse of employee morale, whether that's through Great Place to Work surveys or any other type of engagement surveys that you can conduct. Continuously track that and monitor that to know when the organization needs to shift and develop or establish a different plan or method of attack. Success really is about the small, consistent steps repeated day in and day out. It's not about completely overhauling everything at one time, but making small incremental changes to our day that will have a lasting impact. It's about consistency, intentionality, and action. And as I think back on when my husband passed away and I went through the period and the season that I went through, I've learned that healing is a journey. Much like when you're trying to get in shape or physically fit, you typically cut back on your calories, you work out, right? Until we meet a certain goal. And then oftentimes once we meet that goal, we sort of throw out all of the good routines and practices that we've put in place to get where we are at that point. That's not what we should do, right? In order to be sustainable in our efforts, we have to be consistent. So working on our mental health, working on creating boundaries in our day, working on navigating stress, those are things that is important to do day in and day out. It's not a destination. It is absolutely a journey. And if we can shift our mindset to think that way, that'll help us overall to stay consistently well for ourselves, and then also to show up in a different way for the people around us and also at work. Thank you.
Thanks, Jon'a. That was an absolutely brilliant presentation. It really stuck with me when you were talking about like the microaggressions and the death by 1,000 cuts. I don't know, it just really resonated on the whole like build up over time and the realization that it is like our tolerance level. I think we can all relate to the whole tolerance level for certain situations is dramatically reduced when burned out. And realizing that like to nip it in the bud before the build up gets too much. I really liked it. Sorry, there's a storm here, so I apologize for the background noise. Great. So if we have any questions, you can add them into the Q&A there. In the meantime, that's very annoying. In the meantime, I'm just going to ask a question here.
It's not as loud as you think, Rachel. It's not as loud as you think.
A lot of people on this call, very much coming from the what can I do in my organization perspective. So would you have any advice or any tips of how we can help our organizations and ourselves navigate those feelings of burnout?
Yes. Well, first thing we have to do, I believe, is conduct a personal assessment, right? And identify, like, where am I right now? How am I feeling in this moment? Because sometimes we can become so overwhelmed that it's like, I don't even know, like, what I'm stressed about or what I'm upset about. So to just take the moment to think, pause, reflect, right? Journal, identify, like, what is the area that is causing me angst or giving me anxiety. So that's a really good first step from a personal perspective. After you've identified what it is that's kind of making you feel that way, that helps you to identify the area of rest that you need to take. So, personally, right now, I have been having a ton of sensory overload. It's been a busy week. There's been a ton of meetings. It's been like back to back, back to back. So for me, I listened to my body and I was like, sensory overload is where I'm at. So um, a really good way to kind of break that up is I'll take a quick 5-10 minute walk outside in between meetings where I can, to allow the sun to just permeate within my skin. I just changing the scenery generally helps, and to also just put down the devices for a moment, right? To create a boundary for yourself and for your well-being. So from an organizational standpoint, that assessment piece applies as well, right? We have to better understand as an organization how our people are feeling. What are the pain points? And once you understand what the pain points are, then you can more effectively establish a strategy on how to work to improve things. So, depending on what the pain point is, will help you determine what your method of action will be.
I love that. I actually only recently was trying to figure out how I was going to, with limited time in the day, 3 kids, how I was going to just do more. And someone had recommended to me the Morning Miracle. Now, it was a friend who I think she knew what she was doing. But if anyone's ever read the Morning Miracle, I think it's absolutely amazing. And through, like, I'm on the journey of habit. They say 21 days to establish a habit, 30 days to kind of maintain it. But I've realized that it's actually not about doing more. So through reading this book that I took up to kind of figure out how I was going to do more, it is very much on the boundaries part. And I really like the whole, like, the rubber balls, glass balls stuff, because one of the exercises that you have to do is kind of like to detail out like your non-negotiables versus, look, what can I ease off given the fact that there's this other thing in this week. So yeah, I was really interested as I started reading into the book. I was like, oh, the reason I picked this up is actually not what I'm taking from it, but it's absolutely amazing. So I highly recommend it to anyone. There's
Yes,
a question.
I love that. Just to respond really quickly. So to your point around, you thought you were going to have to do another thing, and sometimes what we need to do is simply to do less.
Yeah.
Just do less. Another good practice is to take an inventory of everything that you have on your plate right now. And because oftentimes we think everything is urgent, everything has to be done right now. But in reality, generally it doesn't, right? So really take stock and inventory of what's on your plate right now. Identify what can wait, what needs to be done right now, what can wait, and what can you say no to. That's the big one. It's like, what can I actually say no to, right? No, I don't necessarily need to be in this meeting, or this project really, maybe it could be better executed by someone else on the team, or what have you. Like, just really take stock of what's on your plate, and realize that you can say no and establish boundaries. Also, just a quick boundary setting tip is schedule time, like put time on your calendar to think. put 30 minutes, twice, 3 times a week. It's just an opportunity for you to not be in meetings and be maniacal about protecting that time, right? It's time that you're not in meetings. It's time that you can actually think. And maybe it's the time that you can focus on getting work done as well. Instead of, right, we meet all day during the day. So then what happens? We have to take work home and do work all night. And then it's a cycle. It's like carve time out in your day to think.
Yeah, so important. Yeah, because you find yourself doing it just back to back meetings, and then you wonder at the end of the day, why am I so disappointed that I didn't achieve more? When you literally have not had a moment to think about what is important to focus on here.
Yeah.
There's a question in here. So regarding like tracking engagement in organizations, how do you manage to track engagement when people are almost too burnt out to fill out another survey? Is there any advice on any kind of methods of how you could do an assessment or a temperature check on how people are doing across the org?
Keep surveys short, right? So do post surveys where they're short and maybe they happen more often than the big grand survey that you may conduct. Also, there are ways that you can kind of check the pulse of employees without a survey as well. So in meetings, perhaps like small team meetings, you can take literally 5 minutes at the beginning of the meeting and just check in and see how folks are doing. Right? Oftentimes when we're in meetings, we just jump right to the business, we jump right to the agenda, and we just move forward. We don't take a moment just to check in with people. That's another opportunity to do that when you have those smaller team meetings as well. And then it also helps to build rapport, it helps to build relationships and team trust and cohesion as well if your people feel like you care enough about them to at least ask how they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that. Comment here from Rachel checking in is in a very personal way is a very personal way to do it. Absolutely agreed, and I think she appreciates that advice. I noticed on the slide, one of your slides there, you had some book recommendations. Do you want to tell us your top 2 to 3 kind of book recommendations you'd advise on the theme of kind of both maybe inclusion and burnout?
Yes. So called Burnout that is written from a woman's perspective and pretty much targets women. Um, However, it is a fantastic read to just really understand like the stress cycle and how sometimes we can put ourselves in the stress cycle daily without even realizing it. So that is a really good source. Brene Brown has some fantastic resources just on how to be more empathetic, how to be a more engaged leader. She talks a lot about how guilt and shame oftentimes sort of cripple us as individuals and especially as leaders. So it's a lot of it is about awareness as well. From an inclusion standpoint specifically, there's a TED talk called The Danger of a Single Story that is fantastic on helping us really understand what inclusion means beyond probably what we understand it to mean today, right? A lot of times when we say diversity and inclusion, people often focus on the difference piece, right? Like the numbers and the differences that we have amongst each other. But inclusion is more around how can we see people for who they are and give them what they need versus what we think that they need. So the danger of a single story is a great resource as well. Belonging is also a really good book to better understand, workplace belonging, creating a sense of belonging, fostering inclusion within an organization as well. And just from an all-around life-changing perspective, I highly recommend Atomic Habits. Atomic Habits is a fantastic book, especially when we talk about how can we create sustainable change. And it's all about like these small incremental changes that we can make each day, but staying consistent with those, that's what helps us get the big sweeping changes ultimately that we want to make and really drive toward that execution. So Atomic Habits is a fantastic book that I always recommend.
Brilliant. Yeah. Also, I've read Atomic Habits, and it is definitely one that you go back to a few times and you take even more from it the next time. Absolutely brilliant. Well, we will leave it there today and wrap up. Thank you so much, Jon'a. I definitely think we've all you definitely left a lot of lingering thoughts in our mind about considering are we burning out, and the fact that stress is normal but burnout is not. So to the audience, remember that we are live all week. More sessions available if you haven't already signed up. I will share the link where you can sign up to them at atlanticfestival.ie. And now we will give you a few minutes before the top of the hour so you can have less sensory noise in the background before you join your next meeting. Thank you again, Jon'a, and have a lovely day all.
Thank you.